let's get into the reason you're here. Our first writer, Patrick Shannon, is a writer and blogger who is published under a pseudonym. He works for an insurance company and lives in St. Charles with his wife and 2 children. Patrick Shannon.
Last time I was here, somebody said that somebody needed to muss up my hair a little bit, so I'm going to do it. This is called Ashes. I stood in the front yard of the parish church in Ballinlough Road in Cork, Ireland, and watched the 3 of them in their dinner jackets making jokes and flicking their cigarette butts off the tombstones of the former pastors, making little explosions of bright ash, and I thought, nothing good can come from this. The 3 included my brother Michael, who was about to get married, his rich commodity trading friend Armitage, who was to be the best man, and their mutual cocaine dealing friend Raoul from Chicago. All 3 of them were bored. The boredom was intensified by the cocaine binge that had started 3 days earlier, with Raoul walking out of the Dublin airport customs gate pulling a baggy chock full of pink flake from his shirt pocket saying, "Hey look, I made it through customs and nobody spotted this." Raoul had always been known more for his ruthlessness than his intelligence, and my brother had rushed up to him and given him a friendly full embrace that included clapping a firm hand over his mouth. The 3 of them were bored standing in front of those graves, but they had to be there because my brother was marrying an Irish teenager whose strict Catholic patriarchal father had insisted that if the marriage was to take place at all, the full proprieties would be observed. Michael had choked and squirmed on this like an eel with a hook down his throat, but the father-in-law was a good and firm man who loved his daughter and who had my brother's number and felt that the marriage would need all the tailwind it could get to even have a chance of working. It was only a few minutes later we were called into the sacristy. My brother seemed rather composed for a man who had not seen the inside of a church for 30 years. I had pushed him as hard as I could to go to confession. Even Raoul, the Puerto Rican drug dealer, recognized the necessity of this. But my brother kept putting it off, and now we could hear the organist warming up with raindrops keep falling on my head. The only one of us who seemed nervous and shaky was the best man Armitage, who, as a Protestant, had never been inside a Catholic church at all. From the way he talked, I knew that he was desperately trying to remember every detail of the misinformation he had heard about the Catholic church services over the years, so he could act appropriately during Mass. I tried to reassure him that he was not, in fact, required to do things like kiss the priest's foot. "Think of yourself as a guest," I said, but this didn't console him because my brother's Irish brothers-in-laws had spent most of the prior evening telling him that the best man was the utter keystone of any Catholic wedding. So we heard the organist give the prearranged signal that told us it was time to report. The priest shook our hands before we filed out, including my brother's, in a friendly but tense way that almost, but not quite, covered up the mutual hatred they felt toward each other. It had only been a week since the priest had called my brother a rake, and my brother had responded by calling the priest. Too bad about confession, I thought. And at that very moment, my brother, who was behind me, turned to the priest and said, "Can I have a quick word with you?" The priest gave him an odd but shrewd look and took him back into the sacristy. How long would this confession take? My brother at one time had been the biggest cocaine dealer on Rush Street in Chicago, beating his competition by providing the product in fashionable little glass jars. While he had never actually killed anybody, his bodyguards had broken the arms of a few competitors before observing the local custom of dropping them off at the Cabrini Green housing projects. My brother was a legend, a large sinner, famous for both his crazy escapades and the size of his libido. He had not only slept with uncountable numbers of women, he had slept with almost every woman I had ever introduced him to, especially the ones I had explicitly warned about him in advance, which made it hard for me to respect them once he had finished with them. He had a charm and a way with him that always seemed to trump anything I could say about his reputation. But he had since cleaned up his act to the extent of giving up the drug trade, and he no longer carried a Browning 9mm automatic with a 12-round clip under his left armpit. Through charm and a masterpiece of a lying resume, he had somehow managed to find a job as a commodity trader at a major Irish bank in relatively drug-free 1988 Dublin. While he made moves toward respectability, the old Michael seemed to be floating just beneath the surface. At his bachelor party just 2 days earlier, he had rented out an entire basement lounge on Leeson Street in Dublin for the night. I had discovered that while his more proletarian Irish friends were giggling through a five-way split of a tiny hashish-fortified cigarette in the gents, My brother and his two Chicago pals were doing 18-inch lines of white power in the ladies. I looked at my watch, wondering how long his Homeric confession might take. It took all of 5 minutes. Then my smug-looking brother and the visibly shaken priest emerged. Armitage was oblivious, of course, but I was gobsmacked, and Raoul gave the nervous little mouth twitch that he used to make when he thought something wasn't quite right, and he needed to fortify himself with some nose candy, but couldn't. We took our places and the wedding began. The bride was beautiful, and she was obviously hopelessly in love. I believe that he loved her too in his own way. He had certainly made significant motions toward becoming a family man, even without the unique event of his confession. But his answer to my question as to why he was getting married in Ireland in the first place kept popping into my mind. Because Ireland is the only place one can still find a virgin anymore, he had said, and he'd been deadly serious. The wedding itself and the reception was a long, wild, happy, drunken Irish affair. At the end of the reception, the men hoisted the bride and the groom on their shoulders and carried them from the hall to their car. And I'd never seen my brother so happy, and I thought, if this man wants to make a new start, this is the most auspicious way to do it. 20 years later, I placed on the dresser a 12-inch square wooden cube containing the ashes of my brother Michael. I was in a cheap hotel in Temple Bar section of Dublin. I had carried him with me all the way from Chicago. I was heading to court to bury him in the presence of the wife and children that he had abandoned 12 years earlier and upon whom he had never laid eyes again. I was going out to get some dinner, and I thought how he would have been itching to rip the guts out of the evening. And there was a part of me that wanted to take him along. But instead, I dug out a photo of him from a happier time playing with his toddler daughter and leaned it up against the box. His wife had kicked him out after 6 years of marriage. She had gotten an annulment and later had remarried about a year before my brother died. She had gotten this annulment several years after he disappeared, and I had helped her do it. His wild philandering had become well known in many circles in Ireland by the time his wife finally had enough. But she told me that having a witness from his side of the fence would go a long way toward convincing the ecclesiastical authorities in Ireland. I was happy to do this. My brother had abruptly disappeared from my life as well as hers, and before he had vanished, he told me that he was never going to cooperate with her in getting a divorce. She needed to be punished for kicking him out. As he explained it to me, her actions had not been warranted, because it was in the nature of a man to sleep with as many women as he could, whereas it was in the nature of a woman to be chaste. And he believed that he in fact had tried very hard anyway. He had been telling me the truth at his wedding reception that when he said his cheating days were over. When I found him with a strange woman when he came to Chicago on a business trip about a year later, he explained to me that he was earnestly resolved never to cheat on his wife unless he was on my side of the Atlantic Ocean. Over time, I saw the boundaries of continents shrink as my brother left Europe, UK, and Ireland in the exclusion zone, then the UK and Ireland. And finally, he religiously avoided adultery when his wife was physically in the same building that he was. The story seemed to amuse the ecclesiastical judge who deposed me in Chicago if his giggling was anything to go by. My sister-in-law ended up with an annulment in record time. Some years later, with my brother still missing, my sister-in-law decided to remarry, and I discovered that the family patriarch had been so impressed by my changing sides, as he put it, during the annulment that he insisted I be invited to the wedding. My brother's son and daughter were now older teenagers, and at one point during the reception, when the black beer had been flowing for a long while, each one in their turn took me aside and asked me to try to find their father. I had looked for him on and off over the years. He had moved around frequently, and I always seemed to find myself about a year behind him. It had always been frustrating, and I had long since stopped looking. But having been cornered by his children while I was under the influence, I vowed to find him, and I went to work on it as soon as I returned to the United States. I found a live email address for him in 2 months. He was hiding in Australia. Since he had disappeared, he had lived in a number of cities in the US and Europe and had run through several fortunes. He reported that he was living in Sydney, that he had a small but profitable business, and that he had given up drugs and alcohol, and that he was comfortable. In a couple of months, he agreed to get into contact with some of our relatives. In a couple more months, to my delight, he agreed to allow me to broker contact with his children. I was very pleased with myself, and I fantasized that I was truly helping him get a new start, and that I might be able to help him make things right after so many years. I awoke from this fantasy one lazy Sunday afternoon to a phone call from a New York City detective. My brother had died suddenly in an explosion of blood from the bursting of the veins in his esophagus brought about by a liver destroyed by a bottle of spirits a day, every day, for over 20 years. He had landed in New York without telling me, broken sick, staying with an old friend and going through half-hearted motions of looking for work. Being the only relative who could possibly afford a funeral, I became the next of kin. The New York police wanted to reassure themselves by doing an autopsy, and I agreed. But then there seemed no point having a wake for him in Chicago. Raoul was in prison. Armitage had become very domesticated, and most of the rest of his friends and our relatives were either scattered or not interested. So I had my brother cremated and sent to me in typical fashion. He got lost in the mail for a few weeks and missed his own funeral mass. But when he finally arrived, I called the Irish and asked them if they would like me to bury him in Cork where his children were. They agreed, and I soon found myself traveling with that horrible little box. Horrible, yes, but strangely intimate as well. As we traveled together, in a sense, I had his undivided attention, or maybe I had my own as I reflected about him. I realized that as sad and angry as I was at the loss and the waste, I had always admired his largeness and presence, in spite of, or even because of, how generally wicked he had been. My own virtue, such as it was pale milk next to the consuming fire of his self-destruction. If my brother pulled a gun on a Mooney who came up to us at a red light, just for the joy of seeing him throw his carnations up in the air and dive for cover, now that's what I call a religious experience, my God said. I was outraged, but I was titillated. If my brother got a confirmed square like me into the London limelight by claiming I was his bodyguard, and if I sat in a shadow and watched him work his way through the women in the crowd and half a dozen bottles of Dom Perignon, it was like having my safe little virtuous cake and feeding off the danger too. I didn't want him to hurt himself, and I certainly didn't want him to abuse himself to death, but oh, the stories. Did this make me complicit? It was more complicated than that. I realized sitting in the Dublin hotel, and again when I put his urn on my lap for the train ride to Cork, that I had defined myself relative to him pretty much all my life. He was the most interesting person I had ever met. And while I may have wanted him to reform, perhaps profoundly wanted him to reform and become a responsible husband and parent, there was a part of me that needed him to be the way that he was. In being both judgmental and admiring, I certainly hadn't helped him, and perhaps I had made things much worse. In Cork, the Irish rallied around to throw an old-fashioned funeral with lots of people at the mass, the cemetery, and the pub. My brother had betrayed many of these people, some profoundly, but in death they seemed to have more or less forgiven him. The stories they told that night over the pints. And yet I didn't get the impression that any of this was really for him. Of course, any wake as such is as much for the mourners as it is for the guest of honor. But as the evening wore on, it became more and more apparent that they were actually doing all of this for me. I had begun to feel this standing at the columbarium at the cemetery, which stood on a low rise overlooking the graveyard. As I turned from placing my brother's ashes in the niche, I looked at all the faces there, the abandoned children, the spurned wife, the lost friends, and I was surprised to feel a wave of empathy and affection from them all. We were starting something new. Beyond them, I saw the sun making bright little explosions of light off the granite tombstones.